In the summer of 2025, the world held its breath. Two of the most powerful nations on Earth were at war. Missiles were flying. Oil prices were shattering records. Shipping lanes were paralyzed. Governments across Asia were rationing fuel, and the global economy was bleeding out in real time. Every major power on the planet watched from a distance. Europe said it was not their conflict. China stayed quiet. The Gulf states were too exposed to act. The United Nations issued statements that nobody read. And then, quietly, from a city most of the world only associates with instability and crisis, came the only man that both Washington and Tehran were willing to trust. He was not a president, he was not a prime minister. He was a general, a soldier who had memorized the Quran in a desert posting, who had been fired from his country's most powerful intelligence agency, who was almost never supposed to reach the top. And yet, in the most consequential diplomatic moment of this decade, it was this Pakistani field marshal who picked up the phone, flew to Tehran, flew to Washington, and did what no one else could do. He stopped the war. This is the story of Field Marshal Asim Munir, and how a country that the world had written off as a basket case suddenly found itself holding the fate of the Middle East in its hands. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, you have to understand what Pakistan looked like just 2 years ago. In 2023, Pakistan was on the edge of economic collapse. Its foreign exchange reserves had dropped so low that the country could barely afford a month of imports. Inflation was eating through household savings. Political chaos consumed Islamabad. A former prime minister had been arrested, triggering protests that shook the country. Power blackouts were lasting for hours every day. The international community looked at Pakistan and saw a nation perpetually one crisis away from catastrophe. A country with nuclear weapons and chronic dysfunction. A place where the military always pulled the strings, where civilian governments came and went, and where the same cycle of instability seemed to repeat endlessly. Nobody was writing articles about Pakistan becoming a global peacemaker. Nobody was predicting that within 2 years, the Pakistani military's chief would be sitting down to lunch at the White House, something no Pakistani general in history had ever done before. And yet, that is precisely what happened. And the story of how it happened reveals something remarkable not just about one man, but about how power actually works in the modern world. Asim Munir's rise is, in many ways, the least likely story in Pakistani military history. He was not from a military family of the kind that traditionally produced Pakistan's generals, the landowing class, the English-educated elite that dominated the officer corps in the decades following independence. His father was a school teacher. He entered the army through a less prestigious route than the famous Kakul Military Academy. He was, by the standards of Pakistan's establishment, an outsider, but he was also exceptionally capable. He rose through the intelligence services, eventually heading both military intelligence and the ISI, Pakistan's powerful inter-services intelligence agency, becoming the only person in the country's history to lead both organizations. His tenure as ISI chief, however, was cut abruptly short after just 8 months, reportedly at the insistence of then Prime Minister Imran Khan. It was a humiliation that would have ended the careers of most men in his position. It did not end his. Instead, Munir continued his military career in other roles, waiting. And then, in November 2022, he was appointed Chief of Army Staff, the most powerful position in Pakistan, the job that arguably runs the country more than any elected office. The appointment itself surprised observers who had assumed his ISI dismissal had permanently damaged his prospects. What happened next surprised everyone even more. In May 2025, India and Pakistan went to war. The conflict was brief, 4 days, but it was the most serious military confrontation between the two nuclear-armed neighbors in decades. Indian airstrikes targeted militant infrastructure across the border. Pakistan responded with force. Several aircraft were lost on both sides. The world watched in genuine terror, because when two nuclear powers fight, even a limited conflict carries the shadow of catastrophe. The war ended with a ceasefire, and in the aftermath, something pivotal happened that would reshape everything that followed. Pakistan publicly backed President Trump's claim that he had personally brokered the ceasefire. India furiously denied it, insisting the agreement was purely bilateral. But Pakistan's endorsement gave Trump a diplomatic victory he was eager to claim. And in doing so, Munir handed Trump something politicians value above almost everything else: credit. That single decision to let Trump take the win opened a door between Rawalpindi and Washington that had never been opened before. Within weeks, Munir was elevated to the rank of Field Marshal, only the second person in Pakistan's history to hold that five-star rank, after the legendary Ayub Khan. By December 2025, through a new constitutional amendment, he was appointed Pakistan's first-ever Chief of Defense Forces, giving him unified command over the Army, Air Force, and Navy simultaneously. It was a consolidation of military authority without precedent in the country's modern history. And it was in that position, with that extraordinary concentration of power and that freshly forged relationship with Washington, that the war between the United States and Iran began. When the U.S.-Iran conflict erupted in mid-2025, Pakistan found itself in a position of extraordinary delicacy. On one side was the United States, Pakistan's most important strategic partner, its largest source of economic assistance, and the country whose endorsement Pakistan needed to access international financial institutions. On the other side was Iran, Pakistan's neighbor, sharing a long and porous western border, a country with which Pakistan had deep cultural and religious ties despite historically tense relations. And there was a third dimension that made Pakistan's position even more precarious. Pakistan had a mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. When Iranian missiles were striking Saudi territory, the theoretical possibility of Pakistan being pulled directly into the conflict as a combatant was real and frightening. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes, was effectively shut down. The consequences were immediate and brutal. In Pakistan's capital, power blackouts became frequent. Fuel prices rose sharply, schools closed. Government officials were asked to work from home to conserve energy. A country already struggling economically was absorbing shocks it could not afford. This was the context in which Asim Munir made a decision that would define his legacy. Instead of picking a side, he decided to become the bridge between them. What made Pakistan uniquely positioned to play this role deserves careful examination, because it is not immediately obvious. Pakistan is not a wealthy country. It is not a military superpower. It does not have the economic leverage of China, the institutional authority of the United Nations, or the historical credibility of European nations that have mediated conflicts for centuries. What Pakistan had in this specific moment was something rarer and more valuable than any of those things. It had simultaneous access to both sides. Munir had built a genuine personal relationship with Trump, the kind of direct, leader-to-leader trust that the American president valued far more than formal diplomatic channels. He had visited the White House for a private lunch months before the war began. He had opened a box of rare earth minerals in the Oval Office, sparking a conversation about Pakistan's untapped geological wealth. He had praised Trump's role in ending the India-Pakistan conflict in terms that resonated deeply with a president who craved recognition. At the same time, Pakistan shares a border with Iran and has deep Islamic cultural ties that gave Munir credibility in Tehran. He made 2 separate trips to Iran in the months following April 2026, meeting with Iranian officials at every level: political, military, and clerical. He was one of the only foreign military leaders in the world who could walk into both the White House and Tehran's halls of power within weeks of each other and be received with genuine trust. In the language of diplomacy, Pakistan was what analysts call a neutral conduit, a channel through which 2 parties who refused to talk directly to each other could still communicate, negotiate, and eventually find a pathway to agreement. The United States and Iran had not held senior face-to-face diplomatic talks since 1979. Nearly half a century of severed communication meant there was no established channel, no trusted back room, no institutional memory of how to de-escalate. Pakistan became that channel. Islamabad became that back room. And Asim Munir became that institutional memory, manufactured in real time through sheer persistence. When the first serious face-to-face negotiations between American and Iranian officials finally happened, they did not take place in Vienna or Geneva or any of the European capitals that have traditionally hosted high-stakes Middle East diplomacy. They took place in Islamabad. The Pakistani capital, usually known in international media for political turbulence and security concerns, was locked down for the occasion. The main boulevard leading to the diplomatic zone was closed. The Serena Hotel, where the talks were held, was sealed off. A convention center nearby that had hosted international press briefings was shuttered. Pakistani officials distributed commemorative mugs for the talks. State media was celebratory. The energy in the city, by the accounts of journalists present, was something between national pride and barely contained amazement at what was happening. Because what was happening was genuinely historic. For the first time since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, senior American and Iranian officials were sitting across a table from each other, face to face, in a formal diplomatic setting. And they were doing it in Pakistan, not despite Pakistan's complicated history, but in part because of the unique position that history had created. The eventual ceasefire agreement that emerged from months of negotiations carried 3 signatures: the United States, Iran, and Pakistan, whose prime minister signed alongside 2 of the world's most powerful governments in a memorandum that will be studied by historians for decades. At the Bergenstock Resort in Switzerland, where the final high-level talks were held in June 2026, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance stood before cameras and publicly credited Munir's perseverance and patience as essential to reaching the agreement. It was a moment that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who had looked at Pakistan's international standing just 3 years earlier. The psychological dimension of this story is perhaps its most fascinating layer. Think about what Munir actually did, stripped of all diplomatic language. He persuaded 2 governments, both of whom believed they were right, both of whom had suffered losses and grievances, and both of whom had public audiences demanding firmness, to stop fighting and start talking. That requires a specific kind of intelligence, not the intelligence of strategy papers and institutional processes, but the intelligence of reading people, understanding pride, and knowing exactly which words to use and which to leave unspoken in any given room. His background in intelligence, in the murky, patient, detail-oriented world of ISI and military intelligence, almost certainly shaped this capacity. Intelligence officers are trained to understand not just what people say, but why they say it. Not just what a government demands publicly, but what it actually needs privately. The gap between a country's stated position and its acceptable settlement is where every diplomatic breakthrough is eventually found. And Munir had spent decades learning how to find that gap. There is also something significant in his personal story that resonates across the Islamic world in ways that Western analysis sometimes misses. The fact that he is a Hafiz-e-Quran, that he memorized the entire Quran during a military posting in Saudi Arabia, is not a small biographical detail. In Islamic culture, this is a mark of profound spiritual discipline and dedication. In Tehran, where the government grounds its authority in religious legitimacy, this mattered. It gave Munir a dimension of credibility that no secular Western mediator could have possessed. He was a soldier who spoke the language of faith, a man of intelligence who operated from a position of religious conviction. In a conflict that was partly about ideology and identity, not just territory and oil, that combination was extraordinarily powerful. Not everyone is celebrating, and the full picture demands that we acknowledge the complexity here. Inside Pakistan, while the public mood has been genuinely euphoric, social media flooded with Pakistanis proudly displaying their passports, declaring that their country had arrived on the world stage, there are serious voices raising serious concerns. Asim Munir now holds more consolidated power than any Pakistani military figure since the era of military dictatorships. He has lifelong legal immunity under a constitutional amendment. He controls Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. He has sidelined civilian political authority in ways that democratic reformers find deeply troubling. A former prime minister has been imprisoned for nearly 3 years. Freedom of speech remains constrained. The democratic institutions that Pakistan has been trying to build for decades remain fragile under the weight of military dominance. The romance between Trump and Munir also carries a historical warning that experienced Pakistani observers are careful to articulate. The United States and Pakistan have been close before, during the Cold War, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, after September 11th. Each time the relationship served both countries' immediate interests, and each time, when those interests shifted, the friendship cooled rapidly, leaving Pakistan to manage the consequences of strategic isolation with little preparation. Romances, as one analyst put it, end. Breakups happen in geopolitics just as in personal life. Pakistan sits in one of the most volatile neighborhoods on Earth, bordered by India, China, Iran, and Afghanistan simultaneously. The United States is very far away. Whatever goodwill has been built in this extraordinary moment needs to be converted into lasting structural benefits for the Pakistani people, not just diplomatic prestige for its military leadership. But step back from the complexity for a moment and look at what just happened from the broadest possible angle. A country that the world had spent decades defining by its crises, its nuclear weapons, its militant networks, its political dysfunction, its repeated economic emergencies, just played a decisive role in ending the most significant conflict the Middle East has seen in a generation. The same country that most Western analysts saw primarily as a problem to be managed has positioned itself as an indispensable solution to a problem that threatened the entire global economy. The same military establishment that outsiders viewed primarily through the lens of regional instability has demonstrated a capacity for sophisticated, patient, multilateral diplomacy that most established powers failed to exercise when it mattered most. Whether this represents a genuine transformation in Pakistan's role in the world or a singular moment made possible by a unique combination of personalities and circumstances will only become clear with time. Geopolitical moments of this kind sometimes plant seeds that grow into permanent shifts. Sometimes they are extraordinary flowers that bloom briefly and then fade as the underlying conditions reassert themselves. What is not in question is what happened. In the room where the most important diplomatic agreement of 2026 was signed, one of the 3 signatures belonged to Pakistan. The man who was fired from intelligence, the son of a school teacher who was never supposed to reach the top, the general who memorized an ancient text by candlelight in a desert city, who then spent the next 4 decades navigating the most dangerous corridors of power in one of the world's most complicated nations. He flew to Tehran twice when others stayed home. He sat with Trump when others were calculating the risk. He hosted talks that the world's most sophisticated diplomatic capitals had failed to arrange for 47 years. And then he stood in Switzerland, beside the representatives of 2 superpowers, and watched an agreement he had built, conversation by conversation, sleepless night by sleepless night, be signed into history. Whether the world gives Pakistan the credit it deserves for this moment is ultimately secondary. History does not always acknowledge its architects in real time. The question that now hangs over everything, over Islamabad, over the Persian Gulf, over the millions of people whose lives were disrupted by this war and whose futures depend on what comes next, is not whether Pakistan arrived on the world stage. It clearly did.